It's time for Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. Since midnight Tuesday, South Korea's 20th president has been in office, not at the presidential house of Cheongwade, but an office compound at the Ministry of Defense. This was a significant break from tradition and Yoon Suk-yeol's first step towards achieving a more open and egalitarian society. Yoon's government hits the ground running as the nation faces various challenges hit by the pandemic, chronic societal issues, and global uncertainties that affect the livelihoods of the South Korean people. So how will the Yoon administration face these challenges? To get a hint, we today invite Dr. Bong Young-sik, Research Fellow at Yonsei University Institute for North Korean Studies, and David Tizard, Assistant Professor of Politics at Seoul University, who joins us in studio today. And, well, a very warm welcome to you both. Very pleased to be able to speak to you today on this very exciting day. And, well, my first question to you, Professor Bong. Now, the Moon government for the past 5 years strove to achieve an inclusive nation, as he called it, based on income-driven growth and rooting out what he called social evils in order to achieve a fairer society. So what will be the vision of the incoming Yoon administration amid various challenges? I mean, what kind of society do you think they're going to aim to achieve?
Well, it may sound paradoxical, but the missions of the new Yoon Suk-yeol government would be almost the same missions that the previous Moon Jae-in government pursued for the past 5 years. You mentioned unity of the society, fairness, and prosperity. So based upon the two principles of South Korean society, which is the liberal democracy in politics and market economy in economy, that the Yoon Suk-yeol presidency will try to promote the liberty of the citizens and the market economy and fairness in the society.
And now, Professor Tizard, some changes that South Koreans have wanted to see for a very long time was fairness in society, but there didn't seem to be too much of this over the past 5 years, as the Moon government's own officials were very much caught up in nepotism scandals, Me Too scandals. So how important is it going to be for the Yoon government to really pursue and to really tackle corruption and social justice? Do you think it's going to be on the list of priorities?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, it's on the list of priorities, and it was for the previous Moon Jae-in administration as well. And if you take that historical context, when we saw the previous presidents in the segments before we started, South Korean presidents were talking about economic recovery. They were talking about building the nation. They were talking about democracy. South Korea has now achieved that. It has a democratic society. It has a relatively stable and prosperous economy on a global scale. And now it's achieved those material conditions. The people want something else. They want these post-material values. They want equality. They want fairness. They want meritocracy. And so it's really interesting that those values are there present in society now, and they're being demanded. Of course, though, it's not really easy to achieve them. You said that the previous administration tried to do that, and they focused on that, yet the results weren't quite there. President Yoon Suk-yeol, he's going to try and do that as well. But can you really control society in that way is a difficult question. I would perhaps just very briefly step back and say, in Korean society, not everybody, but some people might say that with the pop stars, with the celebrities, we expect purity. We expect them to be idols. We expect them to be completely free from scandal. And yet with the politicians, we're quite comfortable with them having DUIs, corruption, and things like that. So maybe this is not a challenge for the president or his administration. Maybe this is a challenge for society and the people and how we view other members of society.
Right, and well, there's still some concern, though, that Yoon's traditionally pro-business party might overlook some social welfare policies that are very much needed, especially in this time when people are struggling. So do you think that they're going to do enough to really focus on improving people's livelihoods as they said they would? I mean, what do you think what are some initiatives that are going to have to be really prioritized as South Korean people face, very dismal job prospects and worsening income polarization?
President Yoon's approach to the economy will be very different from President Moon's. I think we can get that, and that would be obvious anywhere in the world, the right wing and the left wing. Whether President Yoon's economic approach will work, I'm not sure. President Moon's approach seemed to have some challenges. It didn't quite get the results that we wanted. Nevertheless, I think what we would want from these presidents when they do these things is at least recognition, at least acceptance. So while you talk about dismal job prospects and a hard future, I think people in society want to be acknowledged. So there's probably going to be a global recession. We've had this COVID-19 pandemic. Governments around the world have been handing out money hand over foot, necessarily, but there's going to be some repercussions from that. In society, people want to be acknowledged. They want, and this includes not just in an economic sense, but we see disability protests in South Korea. We see the demand for women's rights and labor. We see non-discrimination laws. So it's about economics, I agree with you. But whether these economic policies go through or not is very hard to control. But while they're going through, I think it's important for the politicians, the new president, his administration, to look at the people, to acknowledge their existence, acknowledge the challenges that they're going through. And I think that will have just as big an impact, whether that happens or not, as any economic conditions.
I see. And now, Professor Bong, the votes in the recent presidential election, they were very polarized. And with the local elections and the by-elections coming up in June, of course, what do you think President Yoon is going to have to do to really sway voters in the favor of the ruling, his Conservative Party? I mean, how important is it for the People Power Party to capture the majority of the seats?
It is extremely important for the presidency of Yoon Suk-yeol and his party, the People's Power Party, to capture victory in the upcoming local election, which will be held on the first day of June, because the National Assembly, the legislative body, is dominated by the opposition party, which occupies 172 seats out of 300. So in order for the Yoon Suk-yeol presidency to carry out the types of reforms that are essential for South Korean economy to overcome the backlash of the COVID-19 pandemics and global recession, the president's office should be able to get support from the National Assembly, but that is unlikely to happen because of the dominance of the opposition party. And then the president's only option is to reach out the general public directly by emphasizing the urgency, the national crisis looming larger and larger every day. The household debt in South Korean society is really alarming. It reaches about 1.8 trillion US dollars, about 104% to the national GDP, which is one of the highest, if not the highest level in the world economy. And the corporate debt is also alarming. It is about 113.7% to GDP, which is the highest level in national history of Korea. And you know that the Federal Reserve of the United States has announced that it is willing to continuously increase the prime interest rate in its fight against inflation. So surprisingly, the Yoon Suk-yeol presidency's most urgent task is not dealing with the military threat coming from North Korea, but dealing with these financial time bombs left by the COVID-19 pandemic period. To have these problems in comparative perspective, when subprime mortgage crisis happened in the United States in 2008, the kind of the household debt in which people only pay off the interest, not the principal, would be about 50% of the entire household debt in the United States at the time. Now, among all the household debts in South Korea, the kind of a household debt that people only pay off the interest, not any part of the principal, would be around 80 to 90%. So it's far more alarming situation when it's compared to the situation in the United States prior to the outburst of the subprime mortgage crisis.
So it looks like the Yoon administration already has its hands full with domestic affairs and economics, but of course he does need to pay attention to his foreign policy as well. And Professor Bong, now Yoon already has a meeting with US President Biden on his calendar and possibly a meeting with the Japanese leader too. So what do you think will be his first major steps in terms of foreign policy?
Well, the days of the strategic ambiguity is gone with the inauguration of President Yoon Suk-yeol. I think the Yoon Suk-yeol's foreign and national security policy will be made in the directions to take full advantage of the global standing and power of South Korean economy and modern technology, as well as its own armed forces. It is not just a binary choice between China and the United States, but try to cultivate very pragmatic relations with both China and the United States. And North Korea's continuous provocation with a series of the missile tests and expected nuclear tests for the seventh time would actually make the choices easier to make for the Yoon Suk-yeol president. Because as a government responsible for the survival and safety of South Korean public, the presidency of Yoon Suk-yeol must make effective measures in response to the growing military threats from North Korea. So I think the increased level of the security cooperation between South Korea and the United States, as well as the continuous military development of South Korea's armed forces, would, in the short run, would put additional tension on bilateral ties between China and South Korea. But it is not interest of China nor in the interest of South Korea to exacerbate the bilateral relations. So there will be some effective working relationship to be forged between Beijing and Seoul. I think the Xi Jinping government made it really clear by sending Vice President Wang Chi-san to the inauguration ceremony, which is a very clear sign that the Xi Jinping government wants to have good relationship with the new government in South Korea. Although South Korean government has been vowed to increase the level of security cooperation with the United States.
And of course, as you mentioned, Dr. Bong, Yoon Suk-yeol has talked about Korea playing a bigger role in the world. And my question to you, Professor Tizza, now, what kind of changes or initiatives would you like to see in Yoon's foreign policy in order to make South Korea more global in the world?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's really my position to tell South Korea what they should be doing with their position in the world, because what they've done so far is working, I would suggest. South Korea's position in the international arena has probably never been higher. And going into lectures here, the interest in South Korea from abroad is genuine. I get people from all over the world coming to lectures, coming to South Korean campuses, and there's a fascination with Korea. People want to be here, and this is because of South Korea's cultural successes, the dramas, the movies, the music. South Korea now has a place in the world where it has options. It doesn't have to ask for attention anymore. We also know that in this modern world, problems, issues, they are global. You cannot really isolate yourself, whether it's in terms of disease, in terms of terrorism, in terms of economy. South Korea now has the position to do what it wants, and it will be interesting to see where it positions itself. We've heard Dr. Bong say that it has to sort of mediate this position between America and China, but then we get positions of human rights, and where will he go with that? I think also an interesting conversation will be around multiculturalism. As someone who lives and works here in South Korea, we get more and more people coming into South Korea. The country is becoming more multicultural, and we get this idea of a global citizen and international values and ideas. Can that become more prominent in South Korea? That's more domestic than an international thing, but I think the world is becoming both domestic and international at the same time. And if South Korea wants to see it internationally, it has to have those multicultural values and ideas if it wants them. It has to have them domestically as well, not just when it steps on the plane and goes overseas. It needs to be for the people here, I would think. So that's a challenge. Whether they choose to address it or not will be the choice of the new administration, but that's something personally that I would like to see take place.
Right. Right, so maybe globalism begins at home, and it's a question of whether the Yoon administration can really leverage all these cultural successes that South Korea has seen. And well, Professor Bong, now, of course, in terms of foreign policy, North Korea is very much the number one priority agenda for Seoul. And well, who do you think will be Yoon's point man on North Korea policy as we continue to hear more and more about Pyongyang possibly resuming nuclear testing very soon?
Absolutely. Since the 8th Party Congress held in January 2021, North Korean leadership announced that it will pursue 5-year midterm national defense capability programs. And the 7th nuclear test would be a part of this long-term developmental plans announced by North Korea, alongside with the previous series of the missile tests. So unfortunately, it is almost given that the North Korean leadership is going to conduct another nuclear test in order to complete its capability to top a nuclear warhead on the tactical nuclear warhead on the short range and the intermediate range of missiles that would target U.S. forces and civilian populations in South Korea and Japan, as opposed to North Korea's pursuit of a different type of missile, which is intercontinental ballistic missiles to carry nuclear warhead to the territory of the United States. Now then, what should the Yoon Suk-yeol government of South Korea do in response to North Korea's military development? Yoon Suk-yeol government has avowed that the door remains open for both Koreas to have a meaningful dialogue and even economic cooperations, especially with regard to humanitarian assistance provided for North Korean people. But it is basically up to the strategic decisions of the Kim Jong-un leadership in North Korea whether North Korea is going to respond to these initiatives provided by South Korea, which are already on the table. So we have to wait and see what kind of strategic move Kim Jong-un leadership of North Korea is going to make after North Korea is going to conduct another nuclear test. It might be the similar cycle of the 2017 and 2018 when Kim Jong-un leadership escalated the military tension on the Korean Peninsula to the highest level, altercating with the Trump administration, but made a sudden turn in favor of dialogue and reconciliation with the United States and the Moon Jae-in government of South Korea from the beginning of the 2018. Or this time, North Korean leadership will not repeat the same strategic cycle, but just continue to pursue the completion of its nuclear missile capability and using that as a sole bargaining leverage upon Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington to try to make a big deal, including the relief of existing economic sanctions on North Korea. We have to wait and see.
We will indeed have to wait and see, but I'm afraid our time is up today. Sorry, that was Dr. Bong Young-sik, Research Fellow at Yonsei University Institute for North Korean Studies, and Dr. David Tizard, Assistant Professor of Politics at Seoul Women's University. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thank you.